Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon with the title, Welcome Back, Episcopal Schools, Navigating Legal Issues, Returning to School. I'm David Madison, I'm the Executive Director of SAES, joined today by Mary Catherine Duffy, our Director of Professional Development. It's a pleasure to see everybody today on the webinar. A couple bits of housekeeping. First, the Q&A box is enabled, so as questions pop up, make sure to enter those into the Q&A box, and we'll have time to get to as many questions as we can. No promise that we're going to be able to have time to get to all of the questions, but we will handle as many of those as time will allow. Also, a recording of this webinar will be available in the webinar library for our member schools, as will a copy of the slides in the document library. So using your SAES login credentials, you'll be able to access both of those. And if you need your SAES login credentials, just give Pat Blevins a call in the office and we'll make sure you have access to those ASAP. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our two presenters today. We're joined by Kristen Smith and Susan Garrett of Fisher Phillips. Kristen is in the Houston office and Susan is in the Philadelphia office. And I will turn it over to Kristen.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for being here. We appreciate you having us today. As David said, Susan and I are with Fisher Phillips. We are a nationwide law firm with a special group dedicated to education law. So Susan and I both spend a good bit of time with schools, just like all of you here today. I see some folks who are familiar faces as well as some new folks. So we look forward to getting to know you a bit. We are going to try to be as practical as we can today in our advice for you in returning to campus, returning to school, and what that will mean for your community. We understand that these are really difficult times and that you all are looking for some concrete advice. So we're going to do our best to give that to you today. As Mary Catherine and David mentioned, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll do our very best to get back to you. But also know that these slides will be available for you. So to get started, some initial thoughts on getting back to school. As you've all seen, and you are all being bombarded with emails, the state and local orders on COVID-19, on school planning, they are changing at rocket speed. So it's really important at this time that you designate someone to be in charge of just keeping up with what the changes are with your state, your local orders, the CDC guidance, as well as what might be happening in your diocese. Now, for all of the heads of school on the call, I love you. My husband is the head of school. You're wonderful people, but that's probably not the right duty for you. You have so many things going on. I encourage you to find somebody in your community like Susan and me who are, legal geeks who really kind of get a kick out of following this stuff and have them follow it for you, because as school gets closer, we really expect even the speed of the changes to pick up a bit. So it's important to have somebody following those things. It's also important to have them following some of the law firm legal alerts. So for example, you don't have to be a client and it's completely free to sign up for our legal alerts. Those can just give you lots of free advice on how to get back to school in the safest way possible. The other important piece as you're starting back is really what all of you do. Your employees, your constituents, a lot more comfortable coming back to school if they know that you've been thoughtful in your process over the summer, that you've been abiding by the local orders that are in place, that you've been doing your industry research. So helping keep them in the loop over the summer with regular communications is really important. And that's what you all do best. Now, we do urge you to not have it be death by 1,000 emails. So be sure you're being thoughtful about those emails and keeping them regular. but not too frequent, where again, that can kind of lead to the panic response when there are too many things shooting at your constituents all at once. In terms of getting back to school, the teams and topic, the team that you put together will be key, and the topics that we're going to cover today and we recommend your group cover are here on the screen now. As you put your team together, there are some obvious folks to be on that team. Your head of school, often the CFO is on that team. There are some obvious division heads, things like that. But we also encourage you to think outside the box a little bit about who you include. For example, including a couple classroom teachers who are on the ground and can give you real world experience of what's going on, or at least bringing them in to share their experience from this past spring. You know, hearing from an employee who struggled with distance learning versus hearing from an employee who really thought it was easy and fabulous, can all help you with your planning. As well, with Episcopal schools, you may want to consider having someone either from your parish or your diocese involved on your team. And then, as I mentioned, sort of the topics that we're going to cover here today and that we encourage you all to cover are there on the screen for you. So we're going to start with preparation of your campus. One thing to think about is what kind of signage you're going to have. So some states are already requiring particular signage. So some states require that you have hand washing signs, mask reminder signs, things like that. But being sure you're not only covering those, but you're also just providing people friendly reminders of reporting illnesses, of social distancing. We think there's a chance they'll actually pay attention because it will be news signage to them. So just those friendly reminders around campus. Also evaluating your space and how to maximize social distancing. And this is really where we're encouraging you not to think outside the box, but to think way, way outside the box, probably beyond your comfort zone outside the box. Are there spaces that you can repurpose on campus? Are there ways you can allow additional movement around campus while still providing the kids proper supervision? So things like, we're going to talk a little bit about lunchtime and study hall, things like that. Can you provide some opportunities, especially for, you know, we are all schools in the South. So can we take advantage of the weather by allowing kids to do some of those kinds of things outside? So that is where you really are going to want to put on your thinking and creative caps. We also want you to review student and employee workspaces. So can you, for employees, be getting to a point where you can have either one person in an office or social distance in an office? Where that's not possible, should you be putting in plexiglass or some other kind of divider? Areas where we see congregation, so like teachers' lounges, those kinds of spaces, can we repurpose that to temporary office space? Also looking at student work areas. And that might be everything from in your classrooms to in your libraries, providing, you know, plexiglass enclosed spaces or plexiglass dividers can be helpful. Spacing out those desks, it might be ugly, but we can do it. Again, for decades, you all have tried to figure out ways to bring kids together more face-to-face. And now here we are telling you to separate them. So for example, those of you with Harkness tables, you're really gonna have to think creatively about how you space kids when you're using Harkness tables, or perhaps temporarily stopping the use of those tables. You'll also be thinking creatively about scheduling and preparing your contingency plans. We know there are lots of you who've already got a great start on this. And there are also many, many consultants out there now hankering for your business to help you with this kind of stuff. But thinking creatively about, do we need to have A/B schedules? Are we gonna have alternating days? Is there a way to have a teacher teaching in one classroom with some of the kids and having it video conferenced into another room with a teacher's aide supervising, those kinds of things. You'll also want to be considering transportation. So social distancing on buses, and how does that work? Are we able to get a couple of kids who perhaps live in the same home, in the same seat, but then space between those seats? I know many of you don't provide busing services, but even for things like field trips or other off-campus activities, athletics, you're going to be wanting to think about those buses. You'll also want to be thinking about your walk-in policies for parents. So those with the itty bitties, you know, one of the things we always encourage is, oh, walk your child into the classroom door, say hello to the teacher kind of thing. It may be that for fall, we move those itty bitties even back to a more traditional carpool where they're walked in by an adult, to try to minimize the number of people on campus and the number of exposures. Also looking at those carpool procedures, if you have a very high touch carpool procedure with attendants lifting kids or touching kids, you're going to want to rethink those policies and procedures so that you can best protect your employees as well as the children. And then as well, you'll want to be thinking about your parking lots, both employee and student. Are there ways to social distance while folks are coming in and leaving and moving through those parking lots at high traffic times? You're also going to want to think about, and I know this makes many of you on this webinar cringe, but are there some folks that perhaps you want to have work from home, at least for the fall? In part because it would free up some additional space that you could use for other things. So thinking about, you know, are there some business office employees or are there advancement employees who could really do their work effectively from their home and give you that extra space and frankly, fewer people on campus? Another piece, Susan and I laugh about this because never in our careers have we had more questions about food service. So what are you going to do? Are you going to work with your vendor? Are you going to work with your in-house folks about, you know, self-service lines, about those high-touch areas like shared condiments and beverage, refillable beverage stations, where we have a higher incidence of exposure? We really want to think through those things. What are we going to do about seating? And that's where, you know, I just had a call with a head who, you know, said, gosh, we're going to continue to allow seniors to, juniors and seniors to have off-campus lunch privileges because it gives us some extra space. Others are saying maybe we can add, you know, lunch in the gymnasium. The athletic directors are cringing, but lunch in the gymnasium as well as the cafe, allowing kids to eat outside and being creative about your employees as well. We recognize it's a hassle to have dishes and things from your food service all over campus, but letting your employees go back to their offices or classrooms to eat. Thinking through those kinds of things and trying to minimize as much as possible the high risk behaviors and exposures. You're also going to want to assess some of the high touch areas like communal water stations and coffee stations. We recommend right now that for the fall, you shut them down. If you're having summer program or summer on-campus employees, the same. You encourage your employees this summer to bring their own water, bring their own coffee, and shut those down. Because overall, starting out more conservatively and then loosening things up as you go along is going to be much easier than trying to put the genie back in the bottle after we've opened in a very loose fashion and then we need to backtrack because we're having outbreaks. Especially for those of you in Texas, so deciding whether sanitizing between classes and recess is possible. So our governor has already put out that guidance suggesting that we look at that, and we expect that to be for the fall as well. It won't be surprising if other states follow suit, but are you able to, as students move class to class, have a team go in and sanitize the room between classes? And how are we going to work on that recess equipment, on the playground equipment, and sanitize at least between groups of kids who are playing. Finding time in the schedule to have teachers supervise hand washing for little ones. This is another thing we're already seeing in state orders for the summer, that children must be supervised in washing their hands at least a couple times a day. So be sure you're thinking about how that's going to work into your classroom schedules. Determining what kinds of student materials can be eliminated, and that's everything from, markers and color crayons in the classroom to library books and maker spaces, those things where items are being passed child to child. How can we eliminate those as much as possible? For the fall, we really recommend that you're revamping your field trip plans, in large part keeping those kids on campus, not bringing them out for additional exposure at the museums and things, and then just seeing if maybe in the second semester we can allow those. You're also going to have to work on reconfiguring fine arts performances and assemblies. So everything from being sure you have enough understudies in case more kids are sick than usual, and perhaps having more performances where, the school play runs 3 or 4 nights instead of 1 or 2 to allow folks to sit every other or every third chair. And then we have some special considerations for you all as Episcopal schools. So similar to the fine arts and assemblies, how are you going to configure chapel services so that students are socially distanced? Is it possible to perhaps hold chapel in somewhere other than the chapel? So in a fine arts performance theater or something like that, or to split the kids, to reschedule chapel so that it's smaller groups. Determining a plan for your shared materials. So if kids are coming in and touching prayer books, how are we going to handle that? Right now, we think that it's probably better you go to the electronic option and print off service leaflets for the kids, encourage them to keep their own service leaflet and not be sharing, and then having them drop them in a recycle bin at the end. Other schools have talked about perhaps electronically having a screen where it's electronically projected at the front of the chapel. But just thinking about those shared items. Also adjusting your traditions, such as sharing the peace. So maybe it's that we share words only, or elbow bumps, or head nods. We really want to eliminate those handshakes as much as possible because that's just a high risk activity. Implementing your best practices for communion. So one of the important keys for all of you is really staying in close communication with your bishop, with your parish and rector, with your diocese, to be sure that you are being consistent with what they are doing. That is going to bring you some safety in numbers, but also, as David and I have frequently talked about, an informed bishop is a happy bishop. An informed rector is a happy rector. So really bringing them into the loop is an important one. And they'll be able to share with you sort of what is the diocese doing, or what is the church doing for communion purposes, and get into all those kinds of things. Also, it's an important thing to remember to train your chaplains, altar guild, your acolytes, all of those folks involved in the chapel services about keeping social distance while on the altar, about how you expect them to do communion and things like that. It goes back to, I should have mentioned this earlier, but as we get back to school, don't forget to train your teachers. This is not going to be natural to them. So sending out a single document really is not going to be sufficient. This is going to have to be part of your back to school in service, and teaching them and training them about what your expectations are. As well for chapel, just creating protocols for disinfecting, sanitizing your sacred items. How are you going to disinfect as well the chapel and the altar rail, and have a regular process for that. Another particular area for all of you is, what does pastoral care look like now? Certainly, we know that our communities need it more than ever. But how are you going to more deliberately offer pastoral care? We know that your chaplains aren't hanging around at lunch or after the chapel service to just engage with people. So how are you being more deliberate in offering those services? Also looking at what is your parish or your diocese saying about when is in-person appropriate versus virtual. Of course, you'll also want to look at your state and local orders on that. But when can you provide, in-person pastoral care? And what might the context of that be? Are you, going into the hospital or something like that? Do you have the ability to set up virtual pastoral care? You also want to be sure you're implementing protocols about how to protect privacy when providing virtual pastoral care. So we saw a good bit of this past spring, where folks need to be informed, students, parents, employees, that pastoral care in a virtual world is just less private. We don't know who's going to walk in. We don't know who's in the room. So you want to be sure you're explaining that to folks as they engage in the pastoral care process. And then all of that while still maintaining best practices for one-to-one communications with students, either while present or electronically. Now, we know to some extent we're having to flex some of those policies about one-to-one electronic communications, especially when we're in the distance learning scenario. But training your folks on what your expectations are, even in a distance learning scenario. And then communicating with parents, and this is really key, about what they can expect in terms of interactions when their child's receiving pastoral care. So, is the chaplain emailing ahead the parents and saying, hey, I'm going to have a session with your child on such and so date, either that the parent is supervising to be sure that it's appropriate or is welcome to participate, but making sure that parents understand what they can expect. And then training your chaplains and your other pastoral care providers about how pastoral care right now might be slightly different than your expectations previously. Moving away from the Episcopal pieces specifically to some more general pieces, visitors to campus. So for the fall, we're really encouraging that you may be thinking about a hiatus on volunteers on campus when it first opens. I know that goes contrary to what so many of our communities do and how we rely on parents and others to come in and be room parents or work in the cafe. The fewer people you can have on campus, the better. Again, that may be one of those areas you limit in the beginning and you loosen as things go along. And the same with vendors. To the extent you can have vendors outside of regular business hours and when students are not on campus, that is terrific. And being able to be sure that you know where the vendors are going to be, and then the space can be cleaned after. Also, sort of bringing together, many of our campuses have such open policies and we allow visitors to come and visit all over campus, but really trying to funnel them through a particular area and considering whether you're going to do things like temperature checks or require face masks of them. Many states are requiring that you do screening by questionnaire. So having a protocol in place for the visitors and the volunteers. And again, I know it's hard to think about limiting those folks, but as we just get back to school, we really are encouraging you to think through those options. With respect to face masks more generally, we want you to know that, some local and state orders are requiring them, but we really also are encouraging them even if they're not required. To a great extent, the standard of care is being set by other schools in your area, so be sure you're watching that. So if all schools in your area are requiring masks, you really don't want to be, this is not the area in which you want to be the outlier and the cutting edge. So thinking about having folks wearing masks and always saying, okay, if we get down the road and we're doing okay, we can maybe remove those. Now, you're going to have to think about some creativity around the use of those masks and who's using them and when. But we think that that work, which is definitely hard work, is worth it. Now, there is a difference when I say mask or face covering. We don't think you need to require a medical grade mask or anything like that, but some sort of face covering. We have lots of schools doing the school logo or other funny faces on them or things like that. Now, if you require the masks for your employees, you do need to provide those masks to them. You also need to do a hazard assessment, which is a pretty simple form. Most of your operations folks probably are familiar with them, called a hazard assessment, that just indicates why the face mask is required. We also have lots of schools that for the students are at least providing a mask or two. As I'm sure you have all heard from your uniform providers, many of them are also selling masks as part of the uniform. I did have a head raise the interesting idea of, if we all have uniform masks, how are the kids all going to tell theirs apart? Great question. Maybe it's time to allow monogramming. And then, like I say, we need to work on those practical considerations, like teachers standing in front of the class, teaching. We laugh about, are we going to have a bunch of Charlie Brown scenarios with, I've worked through with some schools things like, can we get the students' desks back 6 feet? So where a teacher could teach at the front of the classroom without a mask, and then as he or she circulates the room, they put their mask on. Those are the kinds of practical considerations you're going to have to walk through. Oh, what was going on there? Oh my, we just got crazy. Let me get back to where we are. I don't even know how that happened. Okay, there we go. So with respect to temperatures, we've had lots and lots of questions about taking temperatures. You can certainly do it. Right now, the EEOC is saying that this is acceptable for employees. We believe you can do it for students as well. This is really, there are a couple of considerations that are important. One is that, even if a person doesn't have a temperature, that doesn't mean they don't have COVID. Another is, how are you practically going to do it? I've had a couple of schools call me. One in particular called me after the first day of summer programs on campus and said, oh my gosh, we had 300 kids coming on campus. We were trying to go car to car to get temperatures. It was a disaster. So you really have to think through, how are you going to execute that every day if you're taking temperatures? Also, the privacy considerations. We do not want you calling out, David Madison, 101.4. We want it to be a private situation where he's not having his medical information shared with his colleagues. For the students, we think that you need to get permission or give notice to the parents at the very least. And then an important piece is that for whoever is taking the temperatures, you don't just send out, the school receptionist or school nurse without proper PPE. The OSHA is currently recommending a mask, gloves, and a robe for anyone conducting this kind of work. Again, that PPE needs to be provided by the school. Also, wage and hour issues. To the extent you have hourly employees standing in line waiting to get their temperature taken, you need to pay them. So that's another important consideration. The same goes for testing. So with the testing, again, this is an area where right now the EEOC is saying that's acceptable. Where we're seeing the biggest concerns are the reliability and feasibility. So are the tests accurate? If you're going to do this, be sure you're doing your research and getting a good, accurate test. Also thinking about the feasibility, because you can test someone today, they walk out your door tomorrow and they may contract it anywhere. So, is it feasible to have regular testing done? Again, the privacy considerations similar to the temperature. parental permission if you're doing it, and then the same PPE and wage and hour concerns as well. I'm going to turn it over to Susan so she can talk with you about some employee issues.
Great. So we're expecting that you're going to have a number of employee questions and situations come up as we get back to school. And we're going to go through some of the scenarios we anticipate, but this is definitely a tricky area where there's a lot of gray. So this is a place where you should consult with counsel just to make sure that you're checking all the boxes and doing it correctly. So our first scenario is, what if an employee refuses to return to work due to a medical condition? Well, your first question there is, what is the job that they're doing? A lot of the guidance is to still let people work from home if they can. So if they can work from home, if they're your bookkeeper or they do something they could do remotely, then that would be an easy thing to allow them to do their job from home. If telework is not available, if they cannot do their job from home, then you need to start looking at whether this is a medical condition under the ADA that you should be accommodating. So you would then want to engage in your typical interactive process with the employee. You would want to provide them with an ADA letter or a form, ask them to provide it to their medical provider, and get information back regarding what is the limitation, what is the restriction. And then ask the medical provider what is the accommodation that the medical provider thinks is necessary. It may be that there are things you can do to accommodate the employee and enable them to get back to school, maybe providing more distancing or additional safety equipment. If there's not, and if their job does require them to be on campus, for example, they're a teacher and they need to be supervising students, then you would need to look to different leave laws, because when accommodation under the ADA is to provide leave. So first you would want to look to see if the Emergency Coronavirus Act provides for a leave that they could use. So for example, if their doctor has said that they should be quarantining, they could get emergency leave under that. So that would give them 2 weeks of pay. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So that would be one option. Now that's only 2 weeks, but at least it would give them some period of pay, because the other leave laws, FMLA and ADA, would be unpaid leave. So you would see if they qualify for any emergency leave under the CARES Act, and then you would then switch to see, are they covered by FMLA? Are they qualified? That would give them a certain period of time, again, unpaid, but it would keep their job protected. They would get to continue with benefits. They would still have to pay their share of the benefits. And even if FMLA expires or they don't qualify, you would still also need to consider ADA. And the Americans with Disabilities Act also requires that leave be considered as an accommodation. So it may be that this employee then also should get to continue out of school on leave. Now, again, that is unpaid, and there's no way to get paid leave unless they qualify for the emergency leave, or they can use their vacation, sick time, if you have anything else like that that's available. So those are the kinds of decisions and processes you're going to have to look at. If there's, no return date, so if you get that information back from the medical provider and it doesn't give any return date, there's an argument that you could terminate the person, because you don't have to allow unlimited leave. But we would be very cautious, and we are not advising terminating employees at this time. So we would really recommend that you continue that leave. But that is something you could call and talk to us about if you feel like it is getting to be to a point where you need to replace the person, and it would be a hardship on the school to continue providing leave. Again, that is a very high standard, and the course requires us to do a lot before we can terminate leave. So again, be careful there. Another scenario is, can you require employees age 65 or those with underlying health conditions to work from home? So kind of the opposite question, can we require those folks to stay at home because we're concerned about them? We don't want the liability or the risk of them coming to campus. That's, again, a very challenging situation. You would then need to do a similar approach. You would need to do that ADA interactive process with their healthcare provider to see if, the risks that they have could be accommodated by the school. And then, if so, you would need to consider putting those in place, likely do so unless they're a hardship to the school. And then if not, you could consider whether they would be a direct threat to themselves if they came to school. So again, you could consider, deciding that they would be a direct threat to themselves if they came to school because of their health conditions, if you could not accommodate them. Again, we really do not recommend that you do that unless we've spoken with counsel and you really feel like you can defend that. But it is a gray area that we could argue they could cause a direct threat to themselves by coming to campus under certain circumstances. So again, that's another situation we could see happening this fall. So one question we've been asked is, what if we know, because, we are very typically careful about asking employees for their health information and about their health. But if we know that the employee has an underlying health condition, we can mention it to them. So if we know they have an underlying health condition and they haven't brought it up, we can go to them and talk to them about whether they may need an accommodation. So that is one exception now, that we can raise health issues with them if we already know about them. And then again, we need to determine what needs to be done. Can they be accommodated if they do have a condition that could prevent them from coming back to campus or not? Now, we're also expecting to see a lot of employees just be concerned about coming to campus. So what if they just don't want to come to campus because they're concerned? And that's going to be one we're also expecting to see quite a bit. So they're under 65, they don't have a health condition. So that's where we really do want to kind of try to be sympathetic, counsel them, talk to them about, as Kristen said, all of the great things we're doing to protect them and our community. But then if they still refuse to come to work, that is a situation where, again, consulting with counsel, you may be able to say, then we can't, hold your job because we do need you to return to campus. And there's not an exception that you fit into. And we're following all of the local directives. So again, we're expecting to see that, and that is a tough situation. You certainly want to be careful and make sure that if there's telework available, you do that first. But we can expect employees to come back if they don't have any underlying health condition or age issue that's going to put them at particular risk.
Hey, Susan, I would like to ask you a question because this was posed, and this is related to that topic. Does this just apply to the employee's health risk or spouses or children who are at risk? Are you going to address that?
That is a very challenging area. So there's an argument that you could have an associated disability. So say you have someone at home who has a health condition and this person can't be exposed because of that situation. There's an argument that that's an associated disability. And we would definitely want you to consult with counsel on that situation specifically, because that is a really gray area right now. But I would not say no to the person. I would call and consult with counsel and see, what the circumstances are. Is it justified? What is the law that the directive in place, does it protect them? And then we would decide what we need to do. And very likely we would say treat it the same as if the employee had the disability. But again, that's a gray area that we really want to consult on.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and so the question, the next one is, what if the employee with an underlying medical condition wants to return to work and her doctor says she can? How can we protect the school from liability if she gets sick? So that's where we do want to make sure we've really done a great job with that interactive process, because hopefully we have provided information for the medical provider to fill out, and that medical provider has either authorized the person to come back to work or has said that they can do so with accommodations that we can put in place. So that's where we want to make sure we've done a good job with that, so we can confirm, we went through the process, we were told that he or she could come back, we're safe to come back. And that should give us some comfort. Now, if you still have concerns and aren't totally comfortable with it, you could see if telework is available and consider offering that to the person. You do have to be careful there. You can't give them a lesser job. And if you do let that person start doing telework, it may open the door for other people in the same position to telework. But you cannot force them to stay away otherwise. If they have been cleared to come, you really need to let the doctor's directive control. And again, do let them know, though, that if they have any concerns to come to you, we do want to still stay on top of it. So what if the employee cannot be at work, but an essential function of the job is teaching and supervision of children? So again, that's somewhat similar to what we talked about. So we do want to go through the interactive process. We want to see if there's an accommodation that will allow them to do the essential functions of their job, which for teachers would be supervising children. If so, we would want to make those accommodations. And if not, we would then need to look at leave, because we could say you cannot do your job with or without accommodation. And so we need to look to other areas, which would be the leave laws we talked about. So, and just a reminder, the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, FFCRA, is still in place until the end of December. So that does give employees the right to take certain types of leave, 2 weeks, and then 12 weeks total for EFMLA for certain areas, for certain situations. So again, if the person is sick, or they've been told to self-quarantine, or they are experiencing COVID-related symptoms and need to seek medical care, or if they are caring for someone who is in one of those first two categories, or if their son or daughter's place of childcare is closed. These are all reasons where they would get 2 weeks of paid leave. And again, the next slide talks about the pay a little bit further. And then EFMLA gives them even a longer time. So keep that in mind, because we definitely expect to see more of this as school starts up again. And again, this slide just kind of talks about what the rates of pay are, because they are a little different. So if you go back to the first slide, for the first 3 reasons, they get 2 weeks at the greater rate of these two pays, the regular rate or minimum wage. For reasons 4 through 6, they get a little different rate of pay. But either under either place, they do get 2 weeks of paid leave during that period. And then for children who are still at home and the parents can't work, they could then qualify for 10 more weeks of EFMLA. So that's, again, if the employee is unable to work because the school or child care is closed. So just keep those in mind, because those still stay in place until the end of the year. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about some terminations or layoffs. You do want to keep in mind that we don't want to have terminated someone who is just coming back from one of these leaves, because that would be a retaliation claim, just like we've had, you're probably used to with FMLA and ADA cases. So again, we can't retaliate for someone taking this type of leave. And so if the employee is sick or has a temperature, we also think you're going to have a lot of these scenarios, and we need to make sure that you understand how to deal with that. First, we're going to need to look to see what is the CDC saying, what is your local government saying. But right now, what the direction is that we should send them home. So if you have someone who comes to school with these signs of COVID, and you can talk to them about that. I mean, you can find out, ask them questions about their symptoms, try to see if this is something different. But if it truly is COVID-related symptoms, you should talk to them about who they've been in contact with at work, usually within 6 feet. And we want to make sure they've had significant contact with them, at least 10 minutes, sometimes up to 30 minutes. There's different guidance on that. And you would then want to notify others at the school of the exposure. Now, you cannot disclose the employee's name. So you would need to say you've just been exposed to someone who has COVID-related symptoms, and then you would want to also send that person home. So you need to take steps to try to figure out who they've been in contact with and let them know about this. And then you want to sanitize the area, make sure you've thoroughly cleaned it, and don't permit them to return if they continue to have any symptoms or a fever. And then we recommend that you have a doctor clear them or give you a negative test result before you have them come back to school. And again, this is where you may be able to pay them because you have that emergency leave available.
For students, it's very similar to with employees. If you have a child who becomes ill at school, the difference is that you can just send an adult home on their own. Many of the children you cannot. So we do recommend you have a space available to quarantine children. We don't think you need to become, a mini pediatrician's office, but if you have a small space or two, depending on how big your campus is, you may need 3 or 4, but if you have a space where ideally they can be checked on by the school nurse who's in PPE, and that they can wait until their parents get there, so we don't have exposure to more children. As Susan said, also with the students, we don't want to disclose names of the sick child. Now, we did learn from the spring, the hard way, I might add, that occasionally parents will say, we don't have a problem with you identifying our child. Just know that even if you have the consent and you do it, be aware a little bit. It got kind of ugly this past spring when we were identifying kids. So be careful about that, and really lean on the side of not identifying them at all. So talking a little bit about the conditions on campus too, with respect to social distancing, we think that regardless of guidance by the state or local ordinances, that you really do want to ensure you're keeping everyone 6 feet apart as much as possible. Obviously, there are going to be areas where it's just not possible. And that's certainly inevitable with those itty bitty kids who, well, and frankly, even a little bit older. I mean, our second grader who's 8 years old, keep him from wrestling with his buddies. It's going to be very difficult. So that's why we recommend those additional pieces of protection like facial coverings and plexiglass dividers. Reducing your classrooms to the number of students required by government ordered limits, and also thinking that if you don't have government ordered limits, that you still consider reducing the size of your classroom or the number of children in your classroom so you can ensure appropriate distancing between them. Thinking about other areas of your campus, so restrooms, lunchrooms, libraries, theaters, how you can best keep 6 feet between individuals with some helpful signage to remind them of the need for social distancing.
Hey, Kristen.
Yes.
Quick question about notification, and we're going to get to all of these at some point, but this one applies back to the notification. Do you need to notify every time someone goes home with symptoms, or only if they're diagnosed with COVID?
So it's funny, we started last spring with, someone's brother was exposed to someone who might have had COVID, we better notify everybody. We have seen a steep decline in that because everybody is exposed to somebody at the grocery store. In general, it is a positive lab confirmed test or a diagnosis based on symptoms by a medical provider under which you want to be giving notice.
Okay.
We've had a lot of questions about the use of waivers. As you think through those waivers, think about the purpose of your waiver. If the intent is to have folks get in the right frame of mind to not be suing the school because they've waived their claims against the school, that's one thing. But do not rely on a waiver as rock solid, bulletproof, and therefore you can just kind of do as you please on campus. Waivers are not necessarily upheld in every state, especially with respect to waiving student claims, parents waiving student claims. Additionally, it's not a substitute for appropriate behavior by the school. You also need to know that with respect to employees, they cannot waive EEOC charges, OSHA claims, or worker compensation claims. So even if you have a waiver for employees, it's not necessarily effective. You want to be careful if you decide to use a waiver that there are, you can have it turned and be used against you in terms of an admission that your campus, you knew the campus was not safe and still brought people back to campus. The other piece is we've seen a lot of pushback lately about the PR aspects of waivers and people not liking them. Finally, before you start a waiver process, you also want to know what is your answer if an employee or a parent says, no, I'm not going to sign. And this is particularly important for those schools where you already have an enrollment contract. So they already have a contract to participate. And now you're trying to get them to sign this waiver. If they say no, does that mean you're going to refund the money? Does that mean you're going to allow them to participate via distance learning? So really think through that before you get too far into it. There's more information on waivers on our website. There are some education alerts, and we have FAQs there that go into quite a bit of detail about waivers. Because that's also, as you look at those, you'll see that there are some good reasons to have waivers. Again, nearly impossible to social distance those kids. And at least it shows the parents that even if we implement our best efforts, we may have an outbreak. Some states will enforce the waivers, so they may be beneficial to your school. And as I said earlier, they often just put people in the right mindset of not suing the school for minor injuries. So the other alternative to a waiver is also an acknowledgement of risk. So you can have employees or parents signing acknowledgements saying, we understand this is the protocol and we understand that the school is doing the best it can. And we know that these are our obligations, you know, to report illnesses, travel, exposure, things like that. They don't want to have as much legal effect as a waiver, but it can be helpful to the extent you were to be sued. So as you go through that waiver or acknowledgement process, be sure you're getting good legal counsel about what you're doing, its legal effect, and whether you want to proceed.
Great.
So Susan is going to go ahead with some more employment-related matters.
Right. So, you know, as a result of this, a number of our schools are finding that they need to reduce their faculty or staff. They have lower enrollment next year. They have less fundraising, less revenue. So we are seeing a lot of schools, you know, consider this. And you just want to keep a number of things in mind. First, you do want to look to see if there's anything you've put in writing. So do you have an employment letter or a contract or a policy that you need to follow? So do keep that in mind, because you may have bound yourself to something through your offer letter or something in your handbook that you need to follow. So, you know, start there and make sure you've checked everything you've put in writing. And then you want to then take the next step of determining, okay, can we justify this reduction in force? Can we justify cutting this person's salary? And then make sure you understand the implications of that.
Hey, Susan.
Yes.
Another question about dismissing someone that was, and you may touch on this in a minute, but
Okay.
Is there any case law around dismissing a healthy under 65 employee who can work but refuses to do so?
Because of COVID, no, I'm not aware of any. So that's why we're being very cautious about, you know, we don't necessarily want to be the first case.
Right. Okay.
So we do want to really caution you before you do that to consult with counsel. So,
Thank you.
yeah, so going on to the next issue with reductions in force. You know, again, this is a high liability area. This is, you know, you're probably used to this, you know, when we terminate an employee, we do sometimes see litigation. So we need to make sure that we still don't do it in a discriminatory way. So the COVID, you know, is not a get out of jail free card. We still need to make sure that we can justify our dismissal. So some schools, for example, might have too many teachers now in third grade and you're going to dismiss one. You need to look and see, you know, is that person I'm choosing to let go in a protected class? Are they going to say that I was really chosen because I'm older, or I just told the school I was pregnant, or I have a disability? So again, you know, do your reductions in force like you would normally and assess, you know, is this person in a protected class? Do they have a claim they could make against the school? If so, you know, you always have the ability to offer them severance. If you offer them severance and they accept it, we would want to make sure that you do it in exchange for having them sign a release, but that would enable you to get a release of any claims they would have so that you would know that you're not going to be sued, you're going to move on. So again, that's something that you can do if you do need to terminate someone who is in one of those protected classes. And again, that's something you'd want to work with counsel on so that you make sure you don't get sued for dismissing someone who does have a potential claim. And the same thing, we've also seen a lot of schools, you know, change the salaries of our employees or reduce their amount of hours. So that, again, you have to do the same analysis for. That is an adverse employment action. So one, you'd want to go back and make sure, have you made any promises to them? Did you put anything in writing, either in their offer letter or in your handbook? And then if not, okay, you consider doing this, but again, that's an adverse employment action. So are you doing it to the 3 older employees at your school, or are you doing it to someone else in a protected class? So again, you just want to make sure that you don't have any liability there. And then a few legal things where you need to make sure that you're still paying the minimum wage, you're still complying with the wage laws in your area. And if they are an exempt employee, there may be a salary basis that you need to make sure you don't go below, or they could lose that salary exemption. And then in some cases, in some states, there are some particular laws that are popping up. So one that we're seeing is in some states, you have to give notice to the employee of their unemployment eligibility. So again, just make sure that you follow all the particulars of your state. And again, with benefits, make sure you understand what the implications are. If you reduce someone's salary, that might take them out of qualifying for your health care. So make sure that you understand what the changes you're making are and what the implications will be for them.
And so we're going to take the last about 5 minutes that we have to answer some of your questions. But one last piece is that really now is the time to update your employee and student handbooks. And we are going to go ahead and provide David with a checklist that he can forward along to all of you that has the various policies that we recommend you revisit in light of COVID. And we are working with numerous Episcopal schools, and we would be happy to work with any of you on your handbooks and sort of reviewing them. Or if you have other questions that come up related to getting back to school, including, reviewing your protocols and things like that, we are happy to help with that. But in the meanwhile, David will be able to forward you the checklist with the various policies, and then also the slides from today. So
that document will live in the document library on our website behind the password. So everyone, you can access that along with the copy of the slides and the recording in the webinar library. You'll need your website login credentials. And if you need to recover those, if you call Pat at the office, she'll assist with that.
Sure.
Yeah, so we do have some questions, and one of them that I think is kind of important because of, at least in Texas, TPSA has informed us that we are no longer needing to adhere to TEA orders specifically, but have plans that are similar to them. How are you interpreting that from a legal standpoint?
And what we are recommending, it's sort of a push-pull of the idea that we love that we're no longer under state regulation and strictly held to it. On the flip side, it's also a beware what you ask, because now we also don't have the cover of that. What we're recommending is that you not stray too far from what TEA is recommending and TEA is doing. But for instance, classroom and square footage per child and social distancing per child. Now, many of our classrooms are a lot bigger and we have a lot fewer children in them. So might we push those numbers a little bit and spread out our classrooms and push the envelope a little bit there? Yes. One where, as I mentioned earlier, we got a lot of questions about was the masks. We still recommend you stick with the masks. So what I would say is, if you're pushing on the TEA guidance a little bit, that's okay. But again, this is not where you want to be an outlier, because we do know that when courts don't know where else to look, they will look to what the public schools did. And we will be, to some extent, measured against that standard of care.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Another one is, are any schools require, and this has come up for me several times, are any schools requiring parental commitment to maintaining tuition payments even in the event of another COVID-19 related suspension, shutdown, or related action? Can you speak to tuition matters?
Yes. So what we want you to be sure you have in place is a good force majeure clause or other clause that allows for you to continue to collect your tuition regardless of the format of school. And many of our schools already have those in place, but we are tweaking them in light of COVID and distance learning. But you want to be sure you have that policy. We prefer it be in your enrollment contract. And the same goes for employees, to have one in your employee contract that you can ask them to teach in a remote setting. But be sure, if you already have those signed documents for next year, go ahead and put them in your handbook for 2021. And then for 21-22, move them to your enrollment and employment agreements.
Okay. Okay, so this is related to, I guess, the notification of the school community. If we have an exposure positive case of COVID in our school, what are our obligations for contact tracing? Do we have to have a system for documenting that contact tracing?
So you do want to document your contact tracing as best you can. As Susan touched on a bit, so in general, it's going to be within 6 feet and between 10 and, right now the guidance is between 10 and 30 minutes of continuous contact. Obviously, with the employees, that's going to be a lot easier to determine than with a 6-year-old. So you are going to need to work with the teachers on that as well, but it's something you're going to want to be careful about. And we're going to have to see a little bit about how that works. If we have a positive test in a class, are we shutting down the class or are we shutting down the school? And that's going to be a little bit case by case as we see how this rolls out.
Yeah, that was one of the another question that someone had. If a student or faculty member is lab confirmed positive with COVID, what is the recommendation for closures? Would it be the whole school, the child's class, the teacher's class, child and siblings class? What would you recommend there?
It's going to depend. So to some extent on circumstances. So for example, if you are a 2-campus school, or you have your itty bitties in one, you have a pre-K 3 or a pre-K 4 kid who tests positive, and they're in the pre-K 4 building or the pre-K early childhood building all day long, it may be that we feel confident in just shutting down that building or those classrooms. But in large part, if we start to see a spread, that's where it's going to come into play with closing down school, in part because we just can't promise that, a 6th grader didn't wander around campus and touch every handrail. So it's going to be a little bit case by case.
So Kristen, we're at the top of the hour. Are you okay to go a few more minutes?
Sure, I am. Susan, are you okay?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Let's go another 5 minutes if that's okay.
Okay, so here is another one. Back to the employees who are taking temperatures for people. If an employee on salary is taking temperature, is there an additional wage issue, or is it just considered that's because they're salaried, that's their time?
Susan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so be careful using if they're salaried, because you really need to be looking at, are they exempt or non-exempt? And you can have an employee who is, paying a salary doesn't make them exempt or non-exempt. So, but assuming that the person is exempt, then yes, you don't have a wage issue because they can work overtime. You don't have to track it.
Okay, here's one. Can teachers video record teaching in front of their students and share the recording to students who are remote schooling? Is that a good way to, I guess the question is around, would that be a way to manage kind of the toggle between kids who are in school and kids who are not?
We can. What we are recommending is that to the extent you're going to record them, this is one of the policies we're encouraging you to update this year, which is that permission is given in the policy. Typically, we're going to put it in the policy where you give approval for your child to be photographed, that we also give approval for recording. And then in your communications with the community, also giving them the opportunity and saying to parents, we are going to be recording. And if you don't want your child recorded, then know that these are the steps you have to take. Cover your camera, ask your child not to participate orally, and email the teacher to let them know that's what you're doing.
Okay. This is one about back to when you were saying sequestering a potentially infected child. Would it be advisable to have a potentially infected child wait outside the building for their parent to arrive with a staff member?
That's going to depend on your space a little bit. In general, it's probably, and frankly, the climate where you are. So in Houston, if it's 110 degrees outside, you don't really want anybody just standing out there when they're not feeling so hot. In general, you're going to want air on the side, if you can, of an indoor sequestered space where a nurse can kind of peek through a window or poke a head in and make sure the child's doing okay. That'll be the preferred method.
Great, thank you. This is guidance on the chorale singing. What is the current thinking on, I would say, chorale rehearsals, performances, that sort of thing?
Right. So there's been this whole school of thought about don't have any singing because people spit on each other and then you get COVID. Right now, that is, as we see it, it's being loosened up a little bit. But the general thinking is we don't yet want kids participating in choir, music, wind instruments because of the spit. I wish I could say that. Word. Right, I wish I could say that more eloquently.
That was the most artful way to explain spit and woodwind instruments I've ever heard.
Yes, right. I agree.
But it is something to think about for back to school of how are we going to social those social distance those kids in choir or somehow help them be able to sing but not spit.
Right.
So it's 5 after the hour. Let's take one more question, MK.
Okay, so I think the last question really goes back to the contact tracing. In reality, how does contact tracing work on a playground? How would you address that?
Can we run screaming from the building right now? Yes. So this is one of the really difficult questions that we've had come up, where, as best you can, if you can have a group of kids on the playground, who is on the playground together. When they leave the playground, the kids wash their hands and the equipment is sanitized, then you've at least limited it to a group of children. If you're not sanitizing between groups of kids, that exposure is infinite. Right. It's also where we have some schools saying that for the fall, recess is going to be less focused on, climbing on the jungle gym and more focused on non-contact kinds of activities.
Okay.
And that's when Susan and I are glad we're lawyers and not school people. Figuring out that piece.
We can offer, David, I don't know if you want we don't have that. We have a few more. We have enough that we can't keep going, but what would you recommend if people want to?
What I would recommend is if you have additional questions, one of two things. Feel free to reach out to Kristen or Susan. Their email is right there on that slide. Or we've got good conversation taking place on the heads discussion board as well. So take advantage of that. But you've got Susan and Kristen's email, so feel free to reach out to them. Kristen, Susan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, guys. It was great.
Thank you for having us. Great questions.
Really appreciate it. And everyone, again, the slides will be available in the document library. And then in a day or two, the recording of this will be available in the webinar library. So thank you all so much. And we will continue to provide webinars and different programs as we all are navigating very challenging waters. So thank you all so much.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.